All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It is 3 p.m. sharp, so we'll go ahead and get started. We are about to start our second to last student success webinar dedicated to the incredibly important topic of test anxiety. Once again, before we do get started, I want to let you know some housekeeping. As I mentioned, this is our second to last student success webinar. If you've missed any of our previous sessions, all of our recordings are available on our YouTube channel, so I highly recommend checking those out if you're interested. Additionally, you will receive a follow-up email with links to that playlist that I just mentioned, as well as a link to the recording of today's session. So again, if you're not able to stay for the full duration, don't worry about it. We have you covered. You will also get a link to the next session that will be covering critical thinking and research skills. So you'll be able to sign up that way for our next webinar. And then lastly, there will be some time at the end of the webinar for some questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, just let us know and we will be happy to address them and go through them. There is a question box attached to your control panel, so you can drop those in there and we'll get to them at the very end. Now, with that said, I wanted to introduce a familiar voice today, my colleague, Dr. Amy Dietzman. Today, she will be talking about something almost all of us have faced at one point in time, and it may have even gotten the best of us, in all honesty, and that, of course, is test anxiety. We're going to learn all about some of the most common causes for test anxiety, steps you can take when studying for a test, some strategies you can employ, and most important of all, some great tips on how to become a more confident test taker overall. So I am super excited to get things going. So I'll pass it along to Amy.
Great, thank you, Maxine. Welcome, everybody. So Maxine just gave you a pretty good idea of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to be talking about great ways to prepare for a test in the weeks leading up, strategies and steps that you can take on the actual test day, and then opportunities to examine what you could improve on your next test day. So we're going to divide this up into 3 sections, basically. You can take what I discussed today and apply it to a test that you're taking in any class, or a standardized high stakes test that you might be taking, or even an online quiz that you're just taking from your kitchen. So let's start by just defining a few things. First of all, we're going to define test anxiety. It's a type of performance anxiety. When there's pressure because of high expectations, or if the stakes are high, people can become so anxious that they are hindered from doing their best. It is sometimes helpful and normal to have nervousness around testing. The energy can keep our minds alert and focused. However, there is a threshold, and sometimes too much anxiety can begin to impair brain functioning. With test anxiety, feelings of worry and self-doubt can interfere with test-taking performance, and that's what we're really going to address today. It's okay to feel nervous, but if that affects your performance, then you might need to consider what you could do to combat it. So let's talk about some symptoms and causes real quick. Test anxiety symptoms can range from mild to severe. It is possible to have mild symptoms of test anxiety and still perform well on exams. Others can feel so overwhelmed that they encounter panic attacks before or during exams. The Anxiety and Depression Association of America describes symptoms of test anxiety as physical, cognitive and behavioral, and emotional. Obviously, the physical symptoms are those you feel in your body, like a racing heart or nausea. The cognitive and behavioral symptoms of test anxiety include negative self-talk, which we all probably do from time to time, avoidance, challenges with focus and concentration, as well as those racing thoughts that you might get during a test. And then there are the emotional symptoms, which can include low self-esteem and depression. And then there are many causes of test anxiety, and they include perfectionism, the fear of failure, stress because you didn't do well on a test before, just underlying anxiety and unfounded fears. Think of that as you're making up all kinds of unrealistic scenarios in your brain and you're freaking out over essentially nothing. Anxiety in general is very common these days, but anxiety around test days can be even worse. If previous test experiences have been anxiety provoking or led to unexpected poor outcomes, then this can add more anxiety with each additional testing experience. So every time you take a test, it gets just a little bit worse. And this anxiety can contribute to you feeling like I haven't studied enough, or this sense of dread around studying and testing. Now, one thing we can do to combat our fears is to think about why we have this fear and come up with an answer to that fear. Either change your behavior or change your thinking. For example, oftentimes we say things like, I'm not ready for this test. And that's pretty realistic. One possible answer to this is to work on your time management and perhaps your perfectionism. Another example is to say to yourself, if I fail this exam, I'm probably going to have to retake this class. This may or may not be true. And if you're really not sure if it's true, but it's messing with your ability to think and study, then it's probably best to go to the source. So remember, we're identifying why we have a fear, but then we're going to address it. So if your instructor is able to, and a lot are, they're able to tell you what you really need to pass the class. I do this for my students all the time. I can manipulate the online gradebook and tell them exactly where they stand given certain grades, certain final exam grades or quiz grades. I can just plug numbers in and let them know. In these examples, you're looking at your fear, you're addressing it by changing your behavior. So as we go along today, I'm going to give you more examples of how you can change your thinking as well. So let's keep going. So like I said, we're going to divide this up into 3 sections. First one is before the test. What can you do before a test to put yourself in the best possible situation? Well, the first is quite obvious, study efficiently. But it's not just study, and it's not just study a lot. It's study efficiently. If you feel confident that you've prepped thoroughly, you'll feel more confident walking into that test. So you want to learn how to study. While you may feel like you have this down, you can always get more tips on how to effectively study. And I did do a study skills webinar, just saying if you want to review that, it's on our YouTube page, which I'll share at the end. But here are a few tips. First, give yourself plenty of study time. Schedule out your study time. If it's a high stakes test or a really big test, you want to study for days, maybe even weeks before the test. Ask questions of your instructor. Ask what the most important concepts are. Ask about the types of questions on the test. Ask for a study guide. Gather as much information as you can. The worst feeling is to sit down for a test, open it up, and see that there are essay questions when you didn't expect them, or a whole section on vocabulary, which is really easy to study, but you didn't because you didn't know it was going to be on the test. And then you want to create a study plan, which is more than just scheduling time. A really efficient student will schedule time, but will also schedule what to do during that time. Are you going to make flashcards? Are you going to review your notes? What big ideas will you go over on which days? When you have big tests and a lot of stuff to study, focus on big concepts and the details around those. Did your instructor spend a lot of time explaining something or assign a lot of additional readings on a specific topic? That's usually a really good sign that that is important. Then establish a routine. I'm going to eat dinner, grab a coffee, turn off my phone, leave it in the other room, and go sit down on my balcony for a study time. I'm going to do this every night, this week, and then you have to do it. Procrastination, I talk about in almost every student success webinar. It's so important because if you procrastinate, you are leading right into more anxiety. You're also avoiding. Avoidance is oftentimes worse than the actual activity because now you're conjuring up scenarios in your mind that aren't even true. It's better to just start and tackle it. If it's midnight the night before a test, you're way too late to start studying. And you've also increased your anxiety tenfold. All week, you've probably been getting more and more anxious, knowing that the test is looming and that you've done nothing to prepare for it. So to avoid procrastinating, One good way to jump in is to take a practice test if you can find one. Sometimes that just helps to focus you in on the studying and gives you a good baseline instead of that overwhelming feeling of what do I do and where do I start? I have all these notes. What do I even do with these? Just as important as the actual content are actual test taking strategies. So we're going to dig a little bit into these. And then lastly is know when to cram. It's a vocabulary quiz. Then if you can take the test and then you can forget all about it and move on to the next thing, then maybe cramming works. Not for every vocabulary quiz, but sometimes. You just have to know when it's effective and when it's not. Cramming all night is never the answer, and pulling an all-nighter can exacerbate your nerves. Having adequate rest, which is 9 to 10 hours a night, is likely to be more beneficial than rereading a text or a book until dawn. When you're tired, your problem-solving abilities are lower. Your brain works more slowly. And this is not helpful when you're taking a hard test. Sleep is directly related to academic performance. I'm saying that again because it's so important. Sleep is directly related to academic performance. So establish a sleep routine. For several days leading up to your test, you should get good rest. Set a bedtime and a wake-up time and be consistent with it so you're not jarring your body and trying to do something totally new the day before or the day of a test. Eat a nutritious breakfast before the test and pack a snack for ongoing energy. Now listen to this. This is so important. Food fuels the brain. So being hungry is not ideal for test time. Look for foods that offer a steady stream of nutrients rather than a sugar high followed by a crash. I mean, donuts are great, but not on a test day. Sugary drinks can cause a sugar rush and then a crash. Caffeinated drinks or energy drinks can actually contribute to anxious feelings. So they don't really help us like we think they do. And I love caffeine, trust me. So let me tell you a story about my son. I love to tell this story because it's the perfect illustration of all of these things. He does every single thing I just told you completely wrong. He procrastinates. Then he tries to cram the night before a test. He pulls all-nighters, drinking crazy levels of caffeine to keep going. Then he gets a nervous stomach on the day of a big test. So he skips the food and drinks more iced coffees. So he is now taking a test with a sleepy brain, an unfueled brain, and too much caffeine, which makes him jittery and anxious. This is not only a recipe for a poor performance, but it's also a recipe for terrible test anxiety, which he does have. And of course, he doesn't listen to me because I try to tell him these things, but I'm his mom. Now, feeling rushed will only amp up your anxiety. So get to your test early. Pack everything you need for the exam on the night before if you have a morning test, and set the alarm so you can get out the door on time. One thing that you don't want to do is rush because you're running late. Rushing will only cause you to have crazy high level of anxiety. It's hard to turn that adrenaline and anxiety down once it's gotten that high. So get there early. And then if you have time, try to take a walk around the building to help relieve that anxiety that you have. Moving your body can help remove nervous energy, and it gets your blood flowing and it makes you feel better. Find your seat, get out your pen or pencil, turn off your phone, get comfortable. Now, that is for a test that you're taking in person, but I want to address those that you take online. This is all still the same for an online test. Get all set up with your computer, a drink, make sure your camera's working if that's a requirement for the test. Find the link that you need to use. Make sure your email notifications are turned off. Give yourself a chance to settle in and take some deep breaths. If you do get there early, or you're sitting there at your computer waiting for the test to come up or whatever it might be, you have time to create a positive mindset. Tell yourself you can do this. Envision yourself acing the test and the way that you're going to feel afterwards. Know that nerves are okay. They are a normal part of school and test taking. You can't possibly know everything. Remind yourself that. that you don't know all the material that can possibly appear on this test, and nobody else does either. Still, you can do your best to get some mileage out of what you do know. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. And one thing I do is I always tell myself, when I'm done, I'm going to reward myself. I'm going to go get my favorite coffee, or I'm going to go get my favorite sandwich, or I'm going to go hang out with my best friend that night. Maybe I'm even just going to go home and take a nap. Something that makes me feel happy and like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm going to reward myself for studying and doing well on this test. Research strategies for the test that you're going to take. For example, if you were going to take the SAT, there are all kinds of strategies you can read about online. And I should tell you that Tutor.com is also part of the Princeton Review. The Princeton Review is a test prep company, so take a look at their resources if you're taking a big standardized type of test. Multiple choice and essay tests, they require different approaches. If it's a teacher-given exam and you know it's multiple choice, then you want to research strategies for taking multiple choice exams. Give yourself practice tests and use them not only to work on your test taking, but also to practice controlling your anxiety. If you're afraid of not being able to finish the exam in time, if time tests really throw you off, then do practice time tests. Even if you just set your own timer, try to simulate what you will experience on the test day so that you can employ your strategies. And know what to expect. Like I said before, ask your instructor what this test is like. Now, that's not the same as asking the question that every instructor hates. Is this going to be on the test? They hate that, but they don't mind questions like, what question types are on this test? How can I effectively study for this exam? Are there any particular concepts I should focus on? Those are the kinds of questions that they would be happy to answer. If it's a standardized test, you can probably look up how much of the exam is focused on which concepts. If you know that only 2 questions on the whole exam are about business law, for example, then you're not going to waste your time studying business law when there are 40 questions about business taxes, right? So you want to study what the test is on. And then lastly, on the day of the test, wear comfortable clothes. The last thing you need to do is feel cold or feel like your pants are digging into your stomach. You want to wear what feels good and what makes you feel confident, because half the battle is just feeling positive and confident. A lot of it is in your mind. So let's switch to during the test. So you prepared, you got dressed, you made it to the testing site, or you just opened up your computer and you're ready to begin. What can you do to calm your nerves now? Well, if possible, if you're taking this in person, you want to sit near the front. This may not be the type of place you like to sit on lecture days, but on test days, it's better to do so because you can avoid the distraction of people walking around in front of you. If it's an online exam, go to a quiet place. Don't take an exam in the same room as your roommate who's watching TV or where your mom is cooking dinner. Set yourself up in a distraction-free zone. Don't wear a watch that vibrates. And if you have your phone in your bag, make sure it doesn't vibrate either. Every time it vibrates, you'll be distracted. Who's calling me? What's going on? If you're allowed to listen to music, you should choose classical music. It's the least distracting for your brain. And don't worry about the person next to you or in front of you who may be going through their test twice as fast, because you never know what strategies they are using. If you are overly distracted, and it's possible, you could also wear earplugs. Take your time. Read the directions thoroughly and read all the answer choices before making a choice or starting the essay. There's nothing worse than putting time into a question and then realizing that you're not solving for X, or the essay you've been writing is off target. Slowing down will help you stay focused. And then expect a few curveballs. Remind yourself, you're not expecting to get 100%. So also, your sense of what questions should appear on the test is not really going to match perfectly with what your instructor or the writer of the test had in mind. You might think, oh, this test is going to be about this, and it just might not be. Therefore, when you encounter a curveball, don't get upset and lose your concentration. Just say, aha, here's the curveball. I expected it. And then make an intelligent guess now, or mark the question and come back to it later. And then watch the clock and manage your time appropriately. Don't just watch the clock and see the time going by. Be aware of where you are on the test, how far you have to go, and how much time you're spending on questions. That'll help you to figure out whether or not you're moving fast enough. Have a strategy before you even start. So are you going to skip questions that you don't know? Are you going to start with the essay questions? Are you going to take a first pass and then come back and check your answers? How are you going to use the scratch paper if you're given it? Most students prefer to carefully work through the questions once rather than rushing through the exam and then leaving time at the end to go back and check. Also, really important, nervous test takers are especially prone to changing correct answers to incorrect answers when they go back through the second time. So be aware of that. And if you go back and start second guessing yourself, stop. Know that your first instincts are usually right. Unless you don't read the whole question or all of the answer choices. Now, this is a very common mistake that you want to avoid. If you read A and B and you say to yourself, yep, it's B, and you mark it, you haven't read C or D. You can't know that B is the best answer if you haven't read the other two answers. And then when you sit down for the test, you don't have to start with the first question, always. Sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't. And you don't always have to complete the test in the exact order that it's laid out. So start with the ones you know. Don't waste your time trying to figure out that one question that has you stumped. Gather all the points for the questions you do know. And if time allows, go back to the questions you skipped and try to answer them. Control your anxiety. If you continue to feel overly anxious, try this anxiety control exercise to reduce your tension. It's so simple, and you might be skeptical that it could actually work, but if you're feeling your heart race, try this. Close your eyes. Breathe in slowly to the count of 7 and exhale to the count of 7. Continue this slow breathing until you actually feel your body begin to relax. Should only take maybe 2 to 4 sequences. Then open your eyes, give yourself a positive, very specific self-talk. You're going to do well, you studied hard, you're doing the best you can. This whole procedure should only take like a minute, and it's worth the time. Deep breathing can slow down your beating heart or your racing mind, so practice these techniques at home too. The very act of concentrating on breathing and thinking can biometrically alter your anxious feelings. Nervousness, remember, it isn't always bad. Nerves can be used to help you focus. So this is a question that I've been asked a lot when I've done any talks about test anxiety. A lot of people say, what do you do if you freeze up in the middle of an exam and you just can't get past this question? Well, step one is to simply pause. Take a moment or two, focus on that mindfulness. Like I just said, maybe take a couple deep breaths. If you're stuck on a particular question, simply skip it. Or if you can't skip it, then just guess and move on to something easier that you feel more confident about. Feelings of fear and apprehension are generally not the problem. The real problem when you freeze is that you're probably asking your memory to recall some information that you learned and you basically filed it incorrectly. It's like in your brain, you put it in the wrong folder. You can usually come back to a challenging question or prompt, and chances are your memory will be jogged in some capacity by a different question. Blanking on an exam often has to do with relying on that memorization. So if you jump to another style of question, that could be enough to just snap you right out of that frozen state. Look over the rest of the test, and often you will see other questions that jog your memory. You can look over the questions you've already answered or future ones. Sometimes the answer to one question is actually in the question portion of another question. So just seeing different keywords and topics might get you started again. Before entering college, you may have been a perfectionist who went into exams feeling you had studied everything you possibly needed to know. You might be a perfectionist in your job. It can be emotionally difficult to let go of perfectionism, but you must try, because in college, it's virtually impossible to learn every detail. So you need to focus on the most important concepts and learn those well enough to be successful. Remind yourself that understanding major concepts will help you guess well on some of the details that you're unable to recall. Just like I said before, you might have a question, it's really hard, it's throwing you off, but you may be able to recall something else that jogs that memory. You might be able to eliminate more of the wrong answers if you study well. You may be able to draw some conclusions based on what you know about some of the answer choices. You may be able to connect one question you did know to one that you didn't know and make an educated guess. So studying, I can't say it enough, studying helps you all the way around. And remember, this is problem solving. You can't do this well when you're exhausted. To help curb your perfectionism, also, know when you've done your best. Sometimes your best will just be a C. Sometimes your best will be an A. Just know yourself and know when you've tried your hardest. And set realistic goals. Try a mission statement like, I want to get an 80% or better on all tests and an 85% or better on all the written work in this class. Maybe you won't get that specific, but knowing what you're asking of yourself will help you to beware of undue pressure. And if you think a class is going to be one way, and then you discover a couple weeks in, it's either way easier or way harder than you thought, then just adjust your goals. All right, so now we're on the third part. You took the test, you're walking out. If you're like me, you might be the type who's going to overanalyze every single part of that test for the next 27 hours. But if you've already had a lot of anxiety leading up to the test, the best thing you might do for yourself is this. Let it go. Don't give a test the power to define you. An exam won't tell you whether you're really brilliant or not brilliant at all. Your performance on an exam most likely depends on how effectively you studied and on the test-taking strategies that you used. Have you ever been in a class with someone who you thought never paid attention and they never ever studied, but they still did really well on the test? We always think, oh, that person must be really smart. But that person also might be really good at test taking. They might have great strategies and great ways of eliminating the wrong answers. And that might be why they do well. So don't compare. Take yourself out, meet up with a friend, go for a walk, get an ice cream cone, take some deep breaths, and don't overanalyze. Because when you get your results from the test, which sometimes that's a few hours later, sometimes that's days later, who knows, that's when you need to go back and evaluate your performance. At this point, a lot of students are over it. They took the test and they said, whatever, it's over. There's nothing I can do now. But that's a terrible move for a student who wants to improve test anxiety, and they want to improve testing strategies, and they want to get better grades. Evaluate what you did well and where you should have focused more. Revisit your notes and determine if you need a new note-taking strategy or if you need a new study strategy. Don't repeat the same study mistakes over and over again, expecting different results. Take some time, evaluate your whole plan of attack, and then come up with a new plan for the next test. So I didn't make all of this up. I did some research. Here's some of the links. And before we get to questions, I just want to remind everybody that Thursday, November 3rd is the 5th webinar in this student success series. I'll be doing critical thinking and research skills. It's a good one, a lot of information in there, so I hope you'll join us. And I'm going to pass it back to Maxine now for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation. Before we do get to questions, which again, everybody, there is a question box attached to your control panel. You can just drop those in. We'll be able to answer those. But I did just want to bring your attention to the screen in front of you. This is where all of our social media handles are. And I would highly, highly recommend you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel because you'll get a lot of information about upcoming webinars that we have coming up, as well as just any other cool events that we're going to be doing. And then again, we do have one more coming up in this series, and the link to sign up for that will be sent out in the follow-up email alongside a link to today's webinar, the recording of it. Now, we did get a couple of questions, Amy, and while some of this stuff was covered in the study skills session that we've done in the past, but I did want to just see if you can quickly answer what are some of the differences between cramming and studying?
Oh, that's great. So cramming is for short-term memory. So if you have what I used to do occasionally for certain tests when they was a hard class and it didn't really matter to what I was majoring in college, perhaps, I might cram the morning of a test, take the test, and for sure, guaranteed, I would forget what I did. So that's the one thing about cramming is it's short-term memory. It's for a short burst. You're going to take a quick vocabulary test. You have other things you're doing. So you just want to make sure you do well and move on. Fine. But studying, effectively studying, is more long-term memory type of thing. And this really works more of the time because most of the time when you're taking a class, the information builds and builds and builds, and then you have a final exam over all of it. So you don't want to just do a bunch of cramming because then the final exam is going to come up and you're going to do it all over again. You'll do much better if you're using your long-term memory, committing what you're studying to your brain so that when you go study for that midterm or that final, a lot of that information is still there. You can retrieve it. You don't have to start from scratch.
Okay, yeah. And on the topic of studying effectively, someone else did ask what like some tips are to make sure your focus doesn't wander, which sometimes some folks might run into that issue a little bit more often.
Yes. Mind wandering during the test or during studying?
During studying specifically.
Got it. Mind wandering during studying. Well, couple of things. First of all, it depends on where you are. So obviously, I'm a people watcher, not obviously to you, but obviously to me. I'm a people watcher. So if I were to sit and study in a library, my mind would wander. I'd be watching people and listening to their conversations. And before I know it, my mind would be wandering. So that doesn't work for me. Now, I could maybe put on some headphones and I would do better. So I have to know that about myself. But what I tend to do is I do best studying in a quiet room, in a comfortable place, by myself, with a cup of coffee. And I tend to set out my study schedule ahead of time. So if I know that in this session, this hour-long time frame I set aside for myself, I'm going to accomplish blank, then that helps me to know, hey, I only have to focus on this for 1 hour. I'm going to do this one thing and then I'm going to get up and do something else. So that's helpful. Also, it's helpful to be organized. You don't want to sit down in a messy space and try to study because that actually is distracting. And then you might find yourself cleaning instead of studying. So that's another tip. And then, yeah, it's really a matter of you have to try different things and see what works. A lot of people just assume I'm a terrible studier or my mind wanders, but they've only tried it one way. So you don't really know if, you listen to classical music and you sit in a different place or you're away from loud noise, or maybe you're sitting outside, maybe you'll find in these different places you do better. So it's best to just try different things, set your schedule for yourself. Don't be afraid to listen to music. Don't try to sit down for 3-4 hours at a time. Give yourself short bursts. And then also another way to help focus your brain is to go for a little walk or something before you study, right before. It helps kind of loosen up everything.
Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. But now we have somebody else asking, they're good at classwork, homework, and studying, And you did kind of go over freezing when taking the test, but um, basically, whenever they look at a question, they freeze up. Do you have any more tips or anything else that you can share about that and how to kind of address that?
Sure. So one of the things that you can do, like I said, is to pause, take a deep breath, look ahead to another question, see if that's helping. Also, you might be the type of person that really needs to focus in on keywords. You might need to circle certain words in the question that might help you cross off words. So sometimes a lot of times a question is going to have a bunch of extraneous information in there to throw you off. Like you might be the type that you need to cross that off, and then you need to circle what the actual question's asking for. Perhaps it's the verb in the question. You might be the type that needs to cross off the answers that you know are wrong, those kinds of things. So you're actively going through the question rather than just staring at it and going, oh my gosh, I don't know. And it's asking me so many things and there's so many words here. How can you narrow down what the question's asking? What can you actively do with that question and see if that might help? And then again, remember, you can flip forward if you can. I know you can't always. If you can flip forward and look at what other questions are ahead, that might help also to get you out of that freeze state. You might see something else and go, oh yeah, that's right. And then go back, and that question now it's obvious to you.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to doing that strategy of essentially like circling the question, moving forward in the test, and then circling back or following back up on that question after I see something else later down the line kind of answers that question for me a little bit.
That's great.
Um, one thing before we continue to some of the other questions, some folks were asking if we're going to share the links and sources that you showed earlier. Yes, there will be a file of the PowerPoint slides for you to go through after the fact, so you can share those with other students that you think might be helpful, as well as access all of those links. We got a question about pacing and during the test, specifically how to watch the clock for pacing as opposed to, or how
Mhm.
to make sure that you're watching the clock for pacing as opposed to just making yourself more nervous.
Yes, right. So what you might want to do is see if there are different sections of the test that you can just divide up. So maybe if there's like a vocabulary section, and then there's a multiple choice section, and then there's an essay section, maybe you kind of in your mind before you even start, you say, all right, I'm going to give myself about 15 minutes to do this part. I'm going to give myself 20 minutes to do this part or whatever. And then don't look at the clock again until you feel as though you've given yourself a little time, 10 minutes maybe, or 15 minutes, like you said you were going to give yourself. Then look at the clock and see if you're kind of on pace to finish that section like you said you would. So that's one way you can do it. But what some people do is they look at each and every question and then look back at the clock. Question clock, question clock. Yeah, that's not a good way to do it. But so it's better to try to look at the test as a whole. Say, how much time do I have to do this? What am I most comfortable with? And then also, it's if you can, and I know you can't always, but start with the section that you're the most confident about. And that can help just sort of ease your nerves a little bit. Get that out of the way. So when you're pressed for time now, you have already completed a part that made you feel confident. So that's another way you could do it if possible. I know some tests online, you just don't have the flexibility like we used to have when we had answer key, like a little answer key sheet. And then, our test was printed out for us. I know that gave us more flexibility to write all over things, and you may not have that.
All right, there's another person who is a student affairs a professional, and they asked what they can do in their position to help students overcome test anxiety before finals.
Ooh, that's great. I think a lot of the strategies that I proposed here could be done with students, some practicing some self-talk, some positive affirmations, working on having a growth mindset with students. These things, all in the head, how we self-talk sometimes ourselves right out of doing well at things. So I think working with students on those kinds of strategies is really helpful. I think maybe a checklist for students on different things they can do, like we just talked about before the test, on the day of the test, after the test, that after the test is the one that nobody does. Not very many people anyways. So maybe some kind of a checklist for students and say, here, try these strategies. And then also perhaps having meetings with students about, and I don't know if you have meetings directly with students, but having meetings with students afterwards where you do evaluate what went well, what didn't go well, what tweaks can we make so that you can do better next time might be good as well.
All right, and then it looks like we have about time for about one more question. And that question is, are there any strategies or resources to increasing self-confidence during exams? Or do you know of any resources that might be helpful
That
or
is
strategies?
great question. I don't know any off the top of my head other than there's probably some of that in the resources that we're going to give you with this presentation on this slide that I just showed. There are some links there and there is some stuff in there, but I don't have anything else more specifically other than I think that a lot of the test anxiety and the negative self-talk and the feelings of inadequacy and all of that, it comes, most of the time for newer students. And I think that we all gain confidence as we go through college and do better and start to have some success. It's all about success begets more success. So I think it's normal for students to start college feeling this way and then to start to get their groove. So I will say that much, but I do think there's some resources perhaps on my references page that you might be able to look into.
And speaking of that references page, would you be able to quickly go back to that?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so again, just to remind everybody that this PowerPoint will be shared out alongside the recording of today's webinar. So you can go through all of these different resources if you want to learn a little bit more about where Amy was getting some of that information from. Uh, but yeah, let's see. I think that's about all the time that we have for today. But I do hope to see all of you at the next session. And again, sign up for that webinar, follow us on social media, and thank you so much for joining us today.